You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, when you hire a company to do work for your company, like an electrician or an accounting firm or a web services company, references are absolutely critical because a company is known by the company it keeps. I'm Michael Mahfood with Group M7 Design, the oldest and largest web services company in East Texas with clients all over the country. And I wouldn't be doing this commercial if Group M7 didn't have Google's highest rated reference on their search engine under Website Design Tyler. In fact, we are rated higher than all of our competitors combined, 48 to be exact. Well, heck, after 26 years, I'd be personally devastated if we weren't number one. Look at our giant portfolio of hundreds and hundreds of our sites at the portfolio section at GroupM7.com. Then it'll make sense to you when I say that, well, since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's the highly rated Group M7 Design.
Welcome, Father.
Thank you, Teresa.
We are in show number 41.
Yes.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yes, it is. Think of these 12 generations, and we're coming up to the last couple of them.
I can't believe it. Really. As I started the series, very excited that we had for almost 50 programs to go. You know, now we're already coming close to that end already of these programs, but we still have a few left, and so today's title is Roman Development.
Yes, we're going to be looking specifically, going back to Rome and looking at that development of the papacy, the institutional development of the papacy. We've certainly learned a lot from Cardinal Newman in the 19th century about the development of doctrine or dogma, and saw how it's there in its primitive state, and then it refines itself over centuries. Doesn't change, it refines itself. And today we're going to be looking specifically at the institution of the papacy and how it also is continuing to refine itself, and this at a critical moment. What happens to the papacy, what we'll be talking about today, sets it up, along with the episcopacies, the bishops, sets it up for the wrenching changes of the Middle Ages, so that there's a continuity that is able to be brought forth into the medieval section that we had covered a year or two ago.
Right.
And so we'll see a linking between those two. Papacy is absolutely vital in understanding how that happens, and that continuity of European civilization as well as of Christianity coming over from one to the other. And there I would turn to a very unknown individual, which we had talked about a number of years ago, a German canon lawyer of the 19th century by the name of Johann Adam Müller.
I remember that because I had the hardest time with his name.
But he did for the institutional church what Newman did for the dogmatic church. He showed the development of institutions because he's a canon lawyer, so he's interested in the makeup of the institution itself, and it's his works that really help us to understand, although they're going to lay dormant for 100 years before people really look back and see the history of the church as this development over time of what Henri de Lubac, who was a great reader of Müller, would refer to as the penetration of history by Christ. That's what our church does. That's what we are. So anyway, we're going to take one look at this vital era of the last part of the 300s and early 400s and see how that takes place.
Sounds great.
Well, the first individual we want to talk about then is Pope Damasus, and we've talked about him twice already. First in context, most recently in context of Saint Jerome. Remember, Saint Jerome had been Pope Damasus's secretary, and it was he who encouraged him to work with the Scriptures, and ultimately, after Damasus's death, Jerome then went off to the Holy Land and did all the work that we had talked about just a little while ago.
Right.
But we had also talked about him early in our course of studies, and it's the work of Pope Damasus he was something of an antiquarian, of going into the catacombs and identifying the actual tombs of the martyrs that is only discovered again in the 19th century by this guy by the name of John Baptist Rossi.
Right.
Yeah. And it is again the monument inscriptions of the Roman martyrs. That's all because of Pope Damasus. Had those markers not been there, we would never have been able to find where those martyrs were buried. So that's another contribution that he made.
What a gift.
Yeah. He made the strongest case that he could as Bishop of Rome, first of all for the historical succession of the popes from St. Peter to the present. And we've seen this already. If we walk away we should walk away with a number of things of having studied the first 12 generations, but that is one lesson that I think is perfectly clear, that he who sits on the throne of Peter is the successor of St. Peter. He makes that perfectly clear, not just historically, that's important historically, but also juridically. Yeah. So Pope Damasus is going to be speaking about that. In other words, and he's not doing this personally for himself, he's doing this for his office, and he shows that the power to bind and loose is his by virtue of that pedigree. And so he refers back to Matthew 16:19, "Thou art Peter," of John 21, the 15th to the 19th verse, the power to bind and to loose, Luke, the 22nd chapter. And so he's grounding this, first of all, in Scripture. These are mandates that Jesus himself gives to his disciples, first of which is always Peter. Peter is always first. And in some cases, he's the only. And I didn't even mention about John's gospel, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. He's talking, you look at that, and the Greek is in the singular, not the plural. So there. And Pope Damasus simply enunciates it. He doesn't invent the Petrine doctrine. I've come across historians in their history books, and they in some of these small books they have to move very quickly, and they say things in a rather offhanded way. And they'll say, well, he invented the Petrine doctrine. He did not invent it. He enunciated it more clearly than had been done before. But it was certainly there before, and it had been enunciated. We've seen this many, many times in various forms. It's also expressed in a series of papal letters that are called Decreedles. Okay, and these Roman Decreedles are very important in showing his authority, not just to bind and loose sins, but even beyond that, for leadership and setting the disciplines within the church. Disciplinary guidelines, for instance, the age and qualifications for priestly ordination. Mm-hmm. This is done through a papal decretal. Okay, rather than let any bishop just decide on his own, this is in a letter that is sent out, and these regulations are established. The degree of affinity as an impediment to marriage. You can't marry your brother, your sister. You can't marry your mother or your father. You can't marry your uncle, your aunt, but you can marry your second cousin twice removed. And so those are the sorts of things that are also. These are the groundings for what's going to become canon law.
Right.
The law of the church. Again, also the mandate of celibacy for bishops and priests and for deacons. And this is nothing new. We've seen this already. It's been well established. But again, there's a decretal now that reestablishes this so that people understand this. If they've forgotten it, if they've forgotten the canons of the Council of Elvira in Spain, well, here it is again. Again made more clear. He inherited a church that was developed already. We've already seen, this is by way of review, we've already seen that the bishops had developed out of the apostles in various cities. We call them churches. Nowadays we call them dioceses. They were aided by two other ordo. One was had spiritual purposes, and the other had administrative. The administrative came first. We know this from the Acts of the Apostles, and that is the office of the diaconate. Originally, it was to do something very administrative, to feed widows and orphans. And then as it develops over the centuries, the diaconate provides the staff of clerks and secretaries to the bishops. There's also the development of an office of archdeacon. And we saw Athanasius was an archdeacon. Is a good example of that. Another one, Optatius, was the archdeacon for Celestinian of Carthage. This is in 370 A.D. And so this is just really an important position within that diocese, but it's administrative.
Right.
That's important. The priesthood, the presbyters were there specifically for spiritual and sacramental purposes. As time went on, they evolved into administrative roles. Certainly today, any particular pastor is going to be worrying about how's he going to keep the school open, how's he going to keep the water out, all those sorts of things. That's all administrative stuff. But originally, his role was specifically for the spiritual and sacramentals, and he is an extension of the bishop, as we're again told in the Second Vatican Council. He is always associated with the bishops. We go back to the end of the first century, and we hear this admonition from St. Ignatius of Antioch, speaking of that in his letters. That's why it's so important for us to know the Church Fathers. They tell us this. They show us this church, and the church that we have today. We didn't wake up one day and just invent this thing.
Right.
It's been with us since Christ. St. Ignatius speaks of this, and we see this as a reality. Sometimes the bishops weren't exactly excited about this, as the case of, if you remember, Polycarp used to put his hands on his ears and go screaming, rushing out of the assemblies. But whether we like it or not, whether the bishops liked it or not, the relationship between a bishop and his priest is to assemble the priests together and listen to them whether they wanted to or not. There's a thing called the Consensus Presbyterium, and that's that gathering of the council of priests. And in fact, it's done very physically in liturgy, in which, if you remember that pontifical mass we talked about, the splendid mass, where you had a semicircle around the bishop. In this case, you had a semicircle of the presbyters of Rome around the bishop of Rome at that beautiful mass that we had looked at. It represents in many ways the scene from the book of Revelations, so that a congregation looking at their bishop and looking at the priests gathered around that bishop in that semicircle, if they know their scriptures, they know the book of Revelations, they can see the parallel with that there. I'm going to talk a little bit about fostering of vocations itself and how this all comes about, and we can see that development. By the time you get to the 300s, and especially the end of the 300s, where it's now safe to be a Christian, and the church has been able to come out of the catacombs and crawl out from underneath the rocks and come in from the mountains and the forests, we find a church, an urban church in particular, very well developed. And one of the first things is done is that the bishop is always, one of his most important jobs is to foster vocations. We certainly saw that here in St. Louis with Archbishop Burke.
Right.
It was so important. He understood that and did foster those vocations. And then the presbyters, the priests, and the deacons are all involved in this too. And the first thing they do is they pay attention to boys, and especially as they get into their school age, what we would call today grammar school, as they're beginning to learn some of the basics. And they pay attention especially to smart and docile boys, that is to say, boys who can be taught. And they invite them to training at the expense of the diocese. And so they'll be not sent away, I mean, it's in the city itself, but they'll be invited to go to schools in which their parents do not have to pay. The bishop will pay for this. And in this case, they're actually schools that are supported by the church. And there they are trained in the basics of grammar, of logic, of rhetoric, the old triduum, a little bit of literature and all of those sorts of things. And in the process, they're also taught how to read Scripture publicly. That is to say, they're being prepped to become lectors. Yeah. And this we see particularly at the Council of Hippo in 393, where this is very clear that this young man, this boy, when he gets to the point of being a lector, and he begins reading as 11, 12 years old, when he gets to puberty, when he gets to the point of puberty, at that point he's invited to meet with the bishop. And the bishop at that time will ask him to make a choice for life. And this choice, so, here's a young man, 13, 14, 15 years old, and he's going to be asked to make a choice for life. And the choice is this: would you like to marry someday and raise a nice Catholic family? And if you do, we would like to invite you to be a lector for the rest of your life. You can be a lector and read the Scriptures publicly. Or would you like to vow yourself to celibacy and then marry yourself to the church and then be open to other clerical offices? And if the young boy says, I think I'd like to get married someday and have a family, they'd say, great. And, we'll continue your role as a lector. If the young boy says, well, I think I'd like to give my life to the church, I think I want to do that, they'd say, great. Now the next thing we need to do is start getting you away from the pulpit and bring you over to the altar. So we're going to begin teaching you as an acolyte. Okay, and so he begins working around the altar as basically a server, and this continues on, and then eventually he'll be called to another lower order called the subdeacon, and he will be called before he's 30 years old. So anytime between puberty and 30 years old, over the next 10, 15 years, he could be called to that. At any time, as an acolyte and a subdeacon, he could go back to the bishop and say, I just met Susie Spider, and she's really cute, and I think I'm going to marry her. And okay, that's fine. But there comes a point in time then when the subdeacon will be invited by the bishop. He'll be called by the bishop to become a deacon. And here we have an interesting situation. In some cases, the ones who are being called to the diaconate are already married, and in that case, then they swear celibacy, and so therefore their wife has a particular veto power over that vocation. But the typical route that I want to continue on, this is the young man who's going through his training. Typically, when he's called to the diaconate, he's then ordained a deacon, and then we would call that today a transitional deacon, and he would serve for as much as 5 years as a deacon. And he's expected to remain celibate the rest of his life, and as in any deacon, priest, or bishop. And then, after having served up to 5 years as a deacon, he would be invited or called by the bishop to priesthood. He could stay as a deacon the rest of his life, and many great deacons did. We can name off a bunch of extraordinary deacons. But if he's called to the sacerdotal life, then he can accept that, and with that, he would be ordained as a priest and serve at least 10 years as a priest. And at the end of those 10 years, he would be available to be elected as a bishop. So if you look at the timeline there, a young man who has been identified by the church and then invited along with a series of these are all voluntary, a series of these steps. By the time he's 45 years old, he could be ordained a bishop. It's very rare that you find a bishop in the early church that's consecrated earlier than 45 years old, but it happens occasionally. But by and large, that's the route. And what you have, Teresa, at this point is a man who is steeped in the church.
Right.
This is not what we find in the Middle Ages of mass priests who just learn the Latin and say mass. This is a highly educated individual who has served for many, many years at the altar and at the ambo, and is very familiar.
Very well studied.
Yes, he's very well studied. Yeah. Now, if he's going to be elected he's going to become a bishop, typically at this time, he would be elected by the people of his diocese and then approved by the clergy. Up until about 400, that's the way it was done. And then the neighboring bishops would come and they would lay hands on him in a consecration ceremony. He would be consecrated as a bishop at that point. Now, by the time you get to Pope Ceresius, who is the pope that succeeds Damasus, there's going to be a shift that's going to take place, and the shift is the election and approval is going to shift. In fact, in one of the letters that Pope Ceresius writes, he uses the term cleri publisque, the clergy and the people. And so there's a reversal at that point. Now, I'll explain why that happens. But basically what now is going to happen is that almost universally you're going to have bishops elected by their clergy, and then the people are going to acclaim them. And I think the shift for that, quite honestly, is because of the growth of the Christian population. When you have more people involved in a diocese, they don't necessarily know who would make a good candidate for bishop, but the priests are going to be, they'll know that better.
Right. And
so as a result, then more and more the bishops, you're going to find bishops who are going to be chosen almost exclusively from the clergy, because the clergy know each other and they've had this incredible education. Rarely they go outside of this. There's the case of a friend of St. Augustine, and I don't know his name because he never mentions him by name, but he writes a letter to someone else, and they're talking about this man who is a philosopher and a professor of rhetoric in one of the cities in North Africa. And when the bishop died, the people proclaimed him as their bishop. This is a layman, okay? They proclaimed him as their bishop, and he was accepted by the clergy. And so the next step would be for him to accept the election and then the consecrations. And St. Augustine writes to this friend, and writes to a third-party friend, and says, well, you know how our friend is. You know how much he loves his wife. And it's going to be a big sacrifice for him to give up the conjugal relationships with his wife and the hope of having a family and all of that. And we know that that's going to be a real difficulty for him. And then we're waiting to find out what happens. And all he says in the letter, he says, well, you know how our friend is, and you know how he'll decide. Well,
but we don't.
Yeah, we don't. Yeah, we don't. But I think there's some important lessons here, one of which is the people in that diocese were still electing their bishops, and they were drawing from the laity as well as from the clergy. And secondly, celibacy is part and parcel of what it means to be a
That's
a
pretty
cleric.
clear, is that
I think that's pretty clear, yeah. Well, Pope Ceresius has a long career. He had been one of those vocations that grew up in the church in Rome, chosen as a young boy for this scholarship, bishop scholarship, if you'd say, and then worked his way through. He is elected by the priests of Rome, of course, if you remember, as opposed to St. Jerome, who thought he was going to get the job, and then Jerome left in a huff and all that. Jerome basically said, well, he's too simple to be a pope. And I think that's not right. Jerome's wrong sometimes.
Right.
And certainly Pope Ceresius was supported by the Emperor Valentinian II. He is a developer also of papal authority. And in fact, the first decretal that we actually have intact is a decretal from Pope Ceresius. We know that there were decretals from Damasus and others, but we don't have the original copies. We do have the original from Pope Ceresius, which tells us that it was so important that people went out of their way to preserve it.
Right.
Okay? And these were actually the canons that came from the result of the Synod of Rome of 386. And it's an interesting one because it condemns a philosopher, Jovinian, who had asserted there was a radical equality between marriage and consecrated virginity. And what he's doing is he's conflating the two into one, and the Pope is saying, no, you can't do that.
Right.
It's interesting that what we find then is that each of these preserved letters implies a Roman primacy over the other churches. Mm-hmm. Again, it's not boastful, it's simply the recognition of the relationship. And also that the papal decisions, these decrees, have the equal weight of a synodal decree. Okay, so when the Pope speaks, he speaks with the same authority as if there were a synod, or whether there was an ecumenical council that had gathered and had made a decree. In fact, the word that's used for these papal decrees is a constitutio. We get the word constitution from that. And there's a big misunderstanding when we get to English, because when we talk about a constitution, we talk about a written document in which there are enumerated rights and duties, and the Constitution of the United States. But that's one interpretation. That's one way of using the word constitutio. The other way is actually an imperial decree. It's laying out and saying we speak here with authority. That's why when you look at the documents of the Second Vatican Council, some of them are referred to as constitutions. And others are referred to in different ways. But these constitutions, those are the most important, and they set out the decrees. There's a basic difference between the document on communications, as important as that is, on the one hand, and the dogmatic constitution of the church or of the liturgy.
Makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, he has a 15-year pontificate and is able to accomplish quite a lot. We don't know as much about him simply because there was an even brighter star that was shining, and that was St. Ambrose. Oh. That's tough to share stage with. And then, of course, even more so than Augustine following after.
Right.
He is followed by a pope that reigns for 3 years, and this is Pope Anastasius. And again, we find even in those 3 years, his letters accepting the authority, the responsibility to defend orthodoxy throughout the church. Often we've seen throughout church history, these 12 generations, that when there's a difficulty, that ultimately it's sent then to Rome to decide. But in this particular case, he makes another step beyond that and says, you don't have to wait to send me this question. It's the role of the Bishop of Rome to defend orthodoxy throughout the church. Okay. Well, he's then succeeded by Pope Innocent I, and he's pontiff for some 15 years. It's interesting that it's believed, we don't have foolproof evidence on this, but it seems as though this is one of those rare cases when a pope is succeeded by his son.
Oh, okay.
It seems as though Anastasius' son was Innocent the First. And undoubtedly, again, it's a good reminder for us about celibacy, that before Anastasius would have been ordained a deacon, Innocent certainly would have been, or could have been, or should have been born. If Innocent had been born after ordinations, Anastasius would never have become pope,
Right.
because he would have been dismissed from the priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I think that's just a little thing for us to constantly remember. We have a lot of his preserved letters. There are 36 preserved Decreedles from Pope Innocent. That says an awful lot. And the topics say an awful lot also. There's a letter concerning the celibacy of clergy. There's another one concerning the baptism by heretics, the validity of baptism by heretics. There's another one concerning reconciliation of the dying, and particularly the anointing of the sick. Okay. There's another one concerning lectors, concerning the public reading of sacred texts. And then also there's another one that speaks of, I guess, you don't want to have... you don't want to have everybody coming to you every day over the littlest minutia. And so there's one letter in which he says that what he refers to as the causae minores, the little stuff, should be settled by the provincial consuls, and that the causae maiores should come to Rome, but only as a court of final instance. Okay. So he's kind of taking care of those things too.
Right.
One of the questions he had to deal with was that of jurisdiction, because there's an overlapping jurisdiction when you get up into the Balkans area. The Patriarch of Constantinople is often looking up into that area saying, look, I'm the one that should be appointing bishops up there. I should be writing the decretals for these areas. But on the other hand, there are whole sections of the Balkans that are very Latinized. And so there was a question, sort of a jurisdictional dispute over that area. And it's Pope Innocent I that solves this, at least temporarily, by appointing the Bishop of Thessalonica as the vicar apostolic over the province of Illyricum. And so that kind of leaves the patriarch out of those responsibilities. Well, there was one patriarch of Constantinople that turned to Innocent, and this, of course, is John Chrysostom, when he ran afoul of that Frankish Byzantine empress, remember?
Right.
Eudonia. It was John turning to Innocent, asking for a trial, Innocent standing by him, and this huge give and take that takes place with this. When the church in the East did not reconcile themselves with John Chrysostom, it's Innocent who then turns around, breaks communion with Constantinople, with Antioch, and with Alexandria. And so you have the schism that eventually is going to be restored. 413, Antioch is going to ask to come back into communion with Rome, recognizing Rome's primacy. Later Alexandria, and then later Constantinople will do the same. But the emphasis in all of this is that the Pope is Peter. You know, if you remember back when we started the series on medieval history and we talked about the papacy, well, this was leading up to the coronation of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III. Pope Leo III had commissioned 2 mosaics for the Lateran, and one of those shows Christ handing to Peter the sign of his authority, the keys, and then he's handing to Constantine a flag, for civil authority. And then if you remember, there's another scene, the other mosaic is Peter sitting on his throne, and he's handing a liturgical cope to Leo III, and handing, I think it's a flag, to Charlemagne. So the importance behind that mosaic is to show that this office of Peter is greater than he who occupies it, but he who occupies it is the representative of Peter.
Right.
Okay,
Oh, I remember that.
And I think that this is all of that is we find this then after these four popes have been building upon this one after another. And then there's always a backslider. And after Innocent died, he is replaced by a man by the name of Zosimus. And he, thanks be to God, reigned only 1 year. This was in 417, 418. However, he does such damage to the papacy in 1 year that it's going to take one really great pope afterwards to put it back together again. Real fast, I'll just tell you some of the things he did. He sent a letter to the bishops of Gaul in which he appointed. Now remember, you have bishops in Gaul. Gaul is a very Catholic, what is today France, and had been for many centuries. Ignatius Irenaeus of Lyon, and you go on and on. But by now, Gaul had been divided up into provinces, so that you had archbishops in these, and it was a very well-functioning church. And so Zosimus, for some reason, decides that he wants to put an archbishop in charge of Gaul.
Oh my gosh!
And so he designates one bishop. It's the Bishop of Aurel. His name is Patroclus, and he says, this is the man who is in charge of all those who are in charge of the church in France. And anyway, the bishops said, no, we're not going to take this. And ultimately, they got together in a synod in 398, and the year that he died. And they basically told this archbishop that he was only an archbishop, not an archbishop, and told the Pope, stop meddling in our affairs. Well, that's kind of a tough situation.
Right.
Zosimus should never have done that. He overstepped his boundaries there, and he got slapped around for it. But it doesn't do anything for the building of the reputation of the papacy by doing that. Right. Also, Zosimus, in that brief time when he was pope, turned around and rehabilitated the priest Pelagius. Well, he's a heretic.
Oh, no.
And there were letters of protest from the bishops, especially of North Africa. I mean, this is St. Augustine had very clearly showed him to be a heretic. And so finally in March of 418, shortly before he died, he rescinded the reinstatement. Later he sent a letter supporting another North African priest to become bishop. And basically what happened was the bishops of North Africa rallied behind the primate of North Africa. So here you do have archbishop in a sense. And they sent a letter back to Pope Zosimus and says this. He says, quote, we'll consider the matter at the next synod. Well, So as I say, the next pope to come after Zosimus is going to have to do a lot of picking up and cleaning up. And it turns out that he had been a collaborator and an assistant to Pope Innocent. And he understood exactly everyone was looking at Zosimus going, whoa, my goodness, Well, anyway, this is Boniface I, and he was pope for 4 years. And he had a rough start because Zosimus was such a mess that when he died, the deacons of Rome got together and elected one of their own to be pope.
Oh, my gosh.
Just on their own. And the priests got together and said, wait a minute, you can't do that. We've got to all be in this together, And so for maybe 24 hours, there was a pope, anti-pope kind of a situation. And there was a reconciliation from this then. There was also a reconciliation with Alexandria, which had followed after Antioch, and a recognition on the part of the church in Alexandria, as in Antioch, that it was the that it was the ministry of the Church of Rome to act as the source of unity among all other Christian churches. So that's that primacy. Yeah. When Pope Boniface died in 422, that led to the election of his deacon, and this was Celestine. And Celestine had been soft on Pelagius. And, we'll take a little look at Pelagianism. It is attractive, especially it's very attractive for Americans, because we like to think that we can save ourselves. And we can do it. Don't worry, God. We'll take care. We'll show you how to do this thing. But and it was attractive for Celestine. But when he was elected Pope, he was very clearly rejected Pelagianism, and then tried to end the Pelagian controversy, especially in Gaul. So he basically does, and while he's doing that, he gets caught up in another controversy, this over in the east of what's known as Nestorianism. And in the end, the Patriarch of Alexandria appeals to Rome. This is Cyril of Alexandria, appeals to Rome, and so he's drawn into this issue of Nestorianism. Nestorius is very shady. It's very difficult to tell whether it's a Christological discussion. He's the one who popularized the title for Mary as the Christotokos, the bearer of Christ, but not the Theotokos, And so ultimately, Pope Celestine draws together a Roman synod. They study the both sides and ultimately decide against Nestorius, and then authorize the Patriarch of Alexandria to remove the Patriarch of Constantinople, who is none other than Nestorius.
Okay.
So, it's the emperor who balks at this. Okay, the emperor says, "Well, who do you think you are? I mean, after all, the Patriarch of Constantinople is my appointment, not yours." And so he pulls out all the guns. He calls together an ecumenical council to stand against the Pope. And this is the Council of Ephesus. Oh. And when the Council of Ephesus studies the heresy, they decide against Nestorius. They are in favor of his removal as patriarch, and then they turn around to the emperor and basically say, "We back the Pope." After the council is over, around that time, the legates sent from the Pope to be part of the council arrive, but it's too late; it's already over. And when they read the canons of the council itself, they basically said, "Thanks for agreeing with the Pope in the first place." So, the end result is this. There is a universal recognition throughout the Church of the singular role that the Bishop of Rome plays in expressing the unity of the Church. I go back to Moeller again when he writes his book, Die Einheit in der Kirche, which unfortunately has never been translated into English. But when he goes and he goes through each of the offices and he looks at the church externally and then internally, spiritually as well as physically. And as he's going through the physical aspects of what is the unity in the church, and he's drawing on the early church fathers to do this, he's showing that the unity of any church, any diocese, is the bishop himself with the priest and the deacons gathered around him. That the ultra-diocesan unity, the supra-diocesan unity, is that of the metropolitan, of the archbishop or the patriarch, and especially as he calls together synods, and that ultimately the universal expression is, from time to time, is the coming together of all the bishops of the world into an ecumenical council, but purveying throughout, because the councils don't meet all the time, purveying throughout is the symbol of unity, which he refers to as the primus. And he's always talking about the Bishop of Rome. He never uses the word Pope. I don't know, but he always calls him the primus, the number one guy. the first among equals, the one who draws us all together. And he's not inventing this in the 1820s. He's drawing upon what we see from the church fathers and from the events that take place in this century that we're talking about right now, and in these particular popes. This is an expression that finds itself expressed in one way or another all the way down to the Second Vatican Council. What we find then is after Celestine, then we have a builder for 8 years. The Pope is Pope Sixtus III. He's responsible for building the Basilica of the Apostles, sometimes known as St. Peter's in Chains. He's the builder of St. Mary Major. He's also the builder of the architect of the baptistry for St. John Lateran. So quite the stuff.
Important churches if you travel to Rome.
Yes, yeah. And then at the time of his death, he had several others who were on the process of missions. He would send them out to meet with other people, and one of those was a priest from Rome who had caught the eye of St. John Cassian. And remember, Cassian is the founder of Western monasticism, and this particular papal legate they had met, and they started a correspondence with each other. And so he had a very a good relationship with this papal legate. Not only him, but also Prosper of Aquitaine had been quite taken with him also. And in 440, he was on a mission up in Gaul, and there were two political rivals, and the Pope was interceding to bring about peace between these two, and so he sent this man up to become, the intermediary. And so he's a very impressive individual, and while he was in the process of doing the work, he got I think I said Celestine, I meant Sixtus III, he got word that Pope Sixtus III had died. And in the same letter, he received word that he had been elected Pope.
Oh, my gosh.
So he packed up.
Keep reading that letter.
Yes. and he went back to Rome.
Oh, my gosh.
Okay, and he was determined that he would, first of all, be the Bishop of Rome. That's the number one thing. And then he would take on that universal role also, and also become like the theologian of the church. And so he's going to do all these in sort of like concentric circles. But the first thing is Rome itself. Is zeroing in, he is the Bishop of Rome. It reminds me so much of John Paul II. He was a Polish guy, And what does he do? He visits like every parish in that diocese.
Right.
He is the Bishop of Rome. And so was Leo the Great. This is Pope St. Leo the Great.
That's who we're talking about.
Yeah. He emphasizes sermons. There are 97 Leo sermons that are in existence today.
Wow.
That tells us that that's pretty important stuff. His writings, we have intact 143 of his letters. We have his liturgical texts, especially a sacramentary that we have. It's called the Veronesis. And it's still with us. So he's doing some really important stuff. Two of his admonitions to the Christians of Rome, the Catholics of Rome, are first of all, and we see this, not just the laity, but also the clergy too. Number one, celebrate the mysteries of Christ by living your baptism. So there's that radical link between, and we're going to see this theologically, a radical link between your membership in the body of Christ through your baptism and the whole living out of that, the mystery of Christ in the liturgy and in life. You don't separate liturgy and life. You don't separate the temple and the world. That the two of them come together, and one is an expression of the other. You come closer to the divine in that temple, but you never leave the divine.
Right.
So that's his first admonition. Really good stuff. And secondly, defend the church from what? From heresies. That's the internal problems, and we might learn from this one, from contemporary pagan culture.
Yes.
And therefore, there's a considerable action toward liturgical renewal and the restoration of basilicas, the encouragement of monastic life, the support of pilgrimages. So he's going to see this as a balm against that pagan culture, contemporary pagan culture, as well as against heresies that could pop up within the church itself. And so, first and foremost, he is the Bishop of Rome, and that's what he is calling people to do. Okay? Mm-hmm. Besides being the Bishop of Rome, he's also the Metropolitan of Italy. And he's also the Patriarch of the West. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we forget that. In fact, one of the Eastern Patriarchs during the Second Vatican Council reminded the Council Fathers that one of the titles of the Pope, among his many titles, is Patriarch of the West. And it was in, I don't remember what session it was in, but it was a very interesting intervention when he said that. And it might have been Massimo Say. He was an incredible guy at the council. But anyway, it caught everyone's attention, and they had forgotten that over many centuries. Uh-huh. Because the only time it was used was at the time of the consecration of the Pope. And then nobody used it since then. And then after that, I think that Paul VI and certainly John Paul II has heightened that awareness. But anyway, just a little thing in the aside. And therefore, what he did was he oversaw synods, certainly in Rome, but that had an effect on the entire province of Italy, as well as the entire Western Church. And these especially dealt with the life of clergy and the way they lived their lives, and then the administration of church goods. And then also, beyond that, on the universal side, after all, he is the primus, and he knows that he's the primus, he is the Pope. And so on that universal side, he sought to foster that universal communion of all the faithful. And he did that by fostering closer relations with the Eastern churches, especially. And here we have yet another ecumenical council that he receives, and that's the Council of Chalcedon. Okay, this is in 451, and the decrees are sent to the Pope, and he approves of all of them except for Canon 28, and he takes that one out, and the Council Fathers accept that. I'll just say real quickly, Canon 28 had to do with making Constantinople the second in the hierarchy of patriarchates. And basically, Leo corrects the council in that by saying, no, there is no second, there is no third, there is no fourth, there is no hierarchy of patriarchates. All the patriarchates, the archdioceses, are all on the same plane. And the patriarchate of Rome, or more than that, just the patriarchate, the primus of Rome, is the center for the entire church. So the unity is of the center in Rome, and then everyone else connected to it. There isn't a hierarchy of like the Archbishop of Toledo is more important than the Archbishop of Smyrna or whatever. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anyway, though that was really significant also in doing that. He regarded the Christology of Cyril of Alexandria, who had been combating, if you remember, Nestorius, and what we see here is that in looking at that Christology of the Patriarch of Alexandria, he has no problem writing to the Patriarch of Constantinople, Flavian, and said, "What's your opinion?" Now, this is a successor to, but not a follower of Nestorius. And then there's also a very interesting letter he writes to the emperor himself, in which he says that the emperor has, in some way, a priestly nature to his own emperorship, because it's his duty to bring the church to harmony and unity throughout the universal church, just as it is spiritually for him to do. It's his to do within the empire physically. So, well, let's take a look then. Are we doing okay with time?
We've got about 3 or 4 minutes.
Whoa, okay. Yeah, we're going to jump in and real fast, just some things then about Leo's theology, Christology and ecclesiology just real quickly. Here it is. It's just basically grounded on the nature of Jesus Christ. Okay, he is consubstantial with his Father, who is God, and he is consubstantial with his mother, who is Mary. Okay, and so therefore he is fully God and fully human. Well, we understand that, but this is important stuff. There is a double consubstantiality, and it has huge theological insights and also has to do with our salvation. Christ's humanity, he's human, connects him to ourselves. He catches up our nature, including our fallen nature, and unites it to the sacrifice that he makes on the cross. He, as a human being, he captures all of that and brings it and nails it to the cross, which capitulates all of the sacrifices of the Old Testament. But it's his divine nature that elevates the sacrifice and achieves then reconciliation between God and man.
Yes.
Okay?
Okay, yeah.
And this is, and Leo is not inventing this, obviously, but he's enunciating it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the important thing for us as individuals. As an individual, I am then baptized into Christ. I become incorporated into Christ, and that's how Christ takes up my sins. That's how he's able then to nail them to the cross and then to seek reconciliation with God the Father. So, the mystery of the liturgy is so vital and important. That's why he spends so much time with it, because the liturgy celebrates this reality and draws us into this reality. And it's done through the entire liturgical year. Leo sees the connection between Christmas and Easter. The two of them are tied together, and ultimately, beyond that, it leads us into the Ascension and us becoming part of the Ascension. He refers to Easter in three different ways. He says it's, I'm using his Latin terms here, it's an oblatio peccati. It's the oblation of sin. Okay, it's the removal of sin. But more than that, it's also the victoria justa. Okay, it's the just victory. And beyond that, it is also for us. That's for Christ. It's the just victory. But for us, it's the justificatio. It's our justification. We are made just before God, not because of anything we do, but because of what Christ did instead. And so our glorification comes through our being a member of Christ. And that's the importance of the church. You get the idea?
Yes.
You know?
Right. And why the importance of baptism?
Yes. Yes. Well, you know, Leo the First is the great. He dies in 461. He is great, I mean, obviously because he confronted Attila the Hun. Don't have time to talk about that. And then all of these other things. But he's great because he pulls together within the office of the Pope all of this theology, all of this ecclesiology, and all of this soteriology that sets us up. We're going to talk later on. We'll end this course of studies talking about another great who was actually outside of the scope of the 12th generation. He's actually the 14th generation. We didn't say a lot about him last time around. That's Gregory the Great. Mm-hmm. And we're going to take a look at Gregory. But before we do that, we want to take a look at arguably the greatest theologian in history, St. Augustine, and we'll spend 3 good sessions on him.
I'm sure he'll take that.
Yes.
All right. Shall we close with the prayer and his blessing?
Sure enough. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Thank you very much, Father.
Certainly.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up where knowledge takes flight.